In the winter of 1939, in the Polish city of Łódź, an 11-year-old boy named Jack Tramiel saw his childhood disappear overnight. He was taken from his home and forced into the Łódź ghetto, where he was made to work in a clothing factory under Nazi occupation. 5 years later, his survival came down to a single decision. At Auschwitz, he was placed in front of Josef Mengele, examined, and judged strong enough to continue living. He was then transferred to a forced labor camp near Hanover, where he would lose his father. When American soldiers from the 84th Infantry Division arrived and liberated the camp in April 1945, Jack Tramiel was only 16 years old. He was severely underweight, carrying less than 100 pounds on his exhausted frame. He had no possessions except the torn clothes he wore. He could not speak or read English. He had no profession to return to, no home to go back to, and no nation he could call his own. But less than a decade later, he would be repairing broken typewriters in a small shop in the Bronx. And within 3 decades, he would step onto a stage in Las Vegas and announce that his company had surpassed $1 billion in annual sales, becoming the first personal computer company in history to reach that milestone. By then, the world knew him as Jack Tramiel. The company was Commodore, and the machine at the heart of its success was a simple beige plastic box with a typewriter-style keyboard and 64 kilobytes of memory. It would go on to become the best-selling single computer model the world had ever seen. But here's the part that rarely makes it into the celebration. Just months after that billion-dollar milestone, Tramiel would be pushed out of the company he had built. And less than a decade later, Commodore itself would be gone. This is the story of how a former typewriter repairman built the computer that brought computing into millions of living rooms, and how the company he created unraveled after he was gone. You're watching the history of American electronics and tech, where we trace the rise and fall of the companies that shaped the electronic age, from the hardware they built to the engineers who made it possible. If those are the stories you enjoy, subscribe and leave a like, because this one begins in a concentration camp and ends with a billion-dollar technology company broken apart and sold off piece by piece. Jack Tramiel arrived in New York on November 10th, 1947. He was 19 years old and had no formal education beyond the harsh lessons of forced labor and survival. He married Helen Goldgrub, another Holocaust survivor he had met while displaced in Germany, and together they began a new life with almost nothing. After enlisting in the United States Army, Tramiel was stationed at Fort Dix, where he discovered the first trade that would shape his future: repairing typewriters. He learned how to free jammed keys on military Hermes machines, clean their intricate mechanisms, and restore equipment that others considered unusable. When his military service ended, he opened a small typewriter repair shop in the Bronx. To make ends meet, he spent his days fixing machines and his nights driving a taxi through the streets of New York. He was neither an engineer nor a programmer. He was a businessman who knew how to fix broken machines and stretch every dollar as far as it could go. Those instincts, more than any formal education, would define his career. Throughout his life, Tramiel returned to the same phrase: "Business is war." To most executives, it sounded like a figure of speech. But for a man who had lived through real war and survived it, those words carried a far more literal meaning. In the early 1950s, Tramiel met Manfred Kapp at the Ace Typewriter Repair Company in New York. The two men joined forces buying, repairing, and selling refurbished typewriters. Before long, Tramiel negotiated a deal to import typewriter components from a manufacturer in Czechoslovakia. But with the country behind the Iron Curtain, shipping those parts directly into the United States was nearly impossible. To work around the restrictions, Tramiel relocated to Toronto on October 10, 1958. There, he and Kapp founded Commodore Portable Typewriter Limited. The company's name reflected Tramiel's own thinking. He wanted a military title because he admired its sense of order and authority. General was already in use. Admiral was unavailable, so he settled on Commodore. Money was scarce from the very beginning. To keep Commodore alive, Tramiel sold a stake in the company to Atlantic Acceptance Corporation. Its president, C. Powell Morgan, became chairman, and the investment gave Commodore enough breathing room to expand beyond typewriters into adding machines and office equipment. In 1962, Commodore went public on the Montreal Stock Exchange. But the stability proved short-lived. Morgan's financial empire soon unraveled, and a later royal commission sharply criticized the practices that had supported it. Atlantic acceptance collapsed, dragging many businesses down with it. Tramiel managed to keep Commodore afloat, but only by the narrowest of margins. Then a Canadian financier named Irving Gould arrived with a $400,000 investment in exchange for a 17% stake in the company. It was the first of several occasions when Gould's money rescued Commodore from disaster. In time, however, that same partnership would become one of the company's greatest liabilities. The typewriter business was fading fast. Japanese manufacturers had flooded the North American market with lower-cost machines, and Commodore's import business was losing money at an alarming rate. Tramiel shifted the company toward mechanical adding machines, hoping they would provide a new source of growth. But the same Japanese competitors quickly took over that market as well. Seeing the pattern, Irving Gould urged Tramiel to travel to Japan and find out why its manufacturers kept outperforming everyone else. During that visit, Tramiel encountered something that changed the direction of his company. Sitting on a desk was a digital calculator. The moment he saw it, he realized the future had arrived. The age of the mechanical adding machine was over. Commodore moved quickly into the electronic calculator business, building its products with LED displays supplied by Bomar and integrated circuits purchased from Texas Instruments. For a short time, the strategy worked. Sales climbed, and the company finally seemed to have found a profitable direction. Then the foundation disappeared beneath it. Texas Instruments saw how much money calculator manufacturers were making and decided to enter the market itself. It began selling its own calculators at prices lower than what Commodore was paying just to buy the chips inside them. For Commodore, it was a devastating blow. Once again, Irving Gould stepped in to keep Commodore alive, this time investing another $3 million. Tramiel used that money to make the acquisition that would reshape the company's future. He purchased MOS Technology, a struggling semiconductor company in Pennsylvania, for little more than the value of its outstanding debts. The agreement included one crucial requirement. MOS Technology's chief engineer, Chuck Peddle, would come with the company. Peddle was the designer of the 6502 microprocessor, a chip that would become one of the most influential processors in the history of personal computing. At the time, Tramiel did not fully grasp the significance of what he had acquired. He was about to discover just how valuable that decision would become. Chuck Peddle walked into Tramiel's office with a direct message. Calculators, he said, had no future. The real opportunity was in personal computers. Tramiel listened. He was a man who had survived by recognizing when the world was changing before everyone else. He did not waste time debating the idea or asking for endless reports. His response was only 2 words: build one. Peddle and his team created the Commodore PET, short for Personal Electronic Transactor. It was a simple metal computer with a built-in display, an integrated keyboard, and a cassette drive for saving data. It was not beautiful. It was not powerful by industry standards. But when Commodore placed newspaper advertisements offering the PA for $599 with delivery in 6 weeks, the response was overwhelming. Orders poured in, totaling $3 million. The message was clear. People wanted a computer they could actually afford. The established computer industry had completely underestimated that audience. Tramiel saw it before anyone else did. He believed computers should not be luxury machines reserved for experts and corporations. His philosophy became the line most associated with him. We need to build computers for the masses, not the classes. The PET found success in schools and across Europe, where Commodore's established dealer network from its calculator business gave the company a distribution advantage that its American competitors could not easily match. But the PET was still a machine for offices and institutions. Tramiel had a much bigger vision. He wanted the computer to leave the workplace and enter the living room. He wanted a computer in every home across America. The challenge was finding the right machine to make that happen, and finding the person who could build it. The opportunity arrived with the home computer explosion of the early 1980s, when a growing number of companies were fighting to bring affordable machines into everyday homes. But Tramiel had something his competitors could not match. Because Commodore owned MOS Technology, It could produce its own semiconductor chips. The company controlled the entire process, from chip design to manufacturing. This vertical integration gave Commodore a massive cost advantage. While companies like Apple, Atari, and Texas Instruments had to rely on outside suppliers and pay market prices for their components, Commodore could build its computers at a fraction of the cost. Tramiel turned that cost advantage into a competitive weapon. The VK-20, released in 1981 with a price tag below $300, became the first personal computer in history to sell more than 1 million units. Tramiel refused to treat computers like specialized equipment sold only to enthusiasts. He placed the VIC-20 in mainstream retail stores like Sears, Kmart, and Toys R Us, putting it on shelves beside toys, games, and everyday household products. The message was simple. A computer was not a luxury item. It was something every family could own. When Texas Instruments entered the home computer race with the TI-99/4A, Tramiel responded with an aggressive price war. Commodore pushed prices so low that TI was eventually forced to abandon the market after suffering losses of hundreds of millions of dollars. One industry executive later summed up the battle by saying that Texas Instruments had been outmaneuvered by Jack Tramiel, but the VIC-20 was only the beginning. Deep inside MOS Technologies' facility in Pennsylvania, a team of young engineers was preparing to create the machine that would transform the entire industry. In the spring of 1981, a 24-year-old engineer named Bob Yance began work on a project that would change computer audio forever, a dedicated sound chip. Yance had been fascinated by electronic music since he was young. He studied the sounds of groups like Kraftwerk and spent his teenage years building analog synthesizers from electronic kits in his garage. At MOS Technology, senior chip designer Al Charpentier had brought Yance onto the team partly because of his deep understanding of music synthesis. While Yance focused on creating the new audio hardware, Charpentier was working on another critical piece of the puzzle, a next-generation graphics chip called the VAC-2. Charpentier and Charles Winterbloy spent weeks analyzing every major machine competing for the home computer market. They studied the Atari 800, the TI-99/4A, the Mattel Intellivision, breaking down their strengths, weaknesses, and the features Commodore could improve upon. They took inspiration wherever they found it. Sprites from Texas Instruments, collision detection techniques from the Intellivision, and advanced bitmap graphics concepts from their own previous designs. Meanwhile, under intense deadlines, Bob Yance created the SID chip, the sound interface device, in only about 5 months. It was far more than a simple audio component. It was a complete synthesizer built onto a piece of silicon, featuring 3 separate sound channels, programmable envelope controls, filters, and ring modulation. No home computer or gaming console available at the time offered anything remotely like it. By November 1981, both custom chips were complete. Bob Russell and Bob Yance approached Tramiel with an idea: build a new, affordable computer that would succeed the VIC-20 and center around these powerful new components. The machine would come equipped with 64 kilobytes of RAM, an enormous amount of memory for the time, especially when that much RAM cost more than $100 on the open market. But Tramiel understood something most executives did not. Memory prices were dropping quickly, and he knew Commodore could turn that advantage into a weapon. He set a deadline: have a working prototype ready for the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas on the first weekend of January 1982. The engineering team, including Yash Terakura, Shiraz Shivji, and David Zimbicki, had less than 2 months to complete it. They succeeded. The project was originally known by the code name VIC-40, but when the machine arrived on the CES show floor, it had a new name, the Commodore 64. The reaction at CES was instant. Attendees crowded around the Commodore booth, struggling to understand how the company could offer so much hardware at such a low price. Years later, production engineer David Zimbicki recalled seeing competitors from Atari staring in disbelief, asking, "How can you do that for $595? The answer was Commodore's greatest advantage: vertical integration. Because the company owned its own semiconductor manufacturing facilities, it could produce the C64 at a cost of roughly $135 per unit. And even as prices continued to fall, Commodore maintained its margins. By early 1985, the retail price had dropped to just $149, yet the machine was still generating profit. For a remarkable stretch from 1983 through 1986, the Commodore 64 dominated the American home computer market, capturing somewhere between 30 and 40% of all sales. Jack Tramiel's son, Sam Tramiel, later recalled that Commodore was producing around 400,000 units every month for several years. The C64 was not hidden away in specialty computer shops. It was sold through everyday retailers, sitting on shelves alongside household appliances and outdoor equipment. It became a gaming machine powerful enough to compete with arcade experiences, while its legendary SID sound chip created an entirely new world of computer music. Composers like Rob Hubbard and Martin Galway pushed the hardware far beyond expectations, creating soundtracks that enthusiasts continue to celebrate decades later. By 1983, Commodore had transformed itself into the biggest personal computer company on the planet. Annual revenue climbed to $1 billion, with profits reaching roughly $100 million. The company's flagship machine, the Commodore 64, would later earn recognition from Guinness World Records as the best-selling single desktop computer model ever created. Estimates vary, but total sales are widely believed to have reached between 12 and 17 million units during its nearly 12 years of production. But buried beneath that incredible success was a warning sign, a fracture hidden inside the foundation. The engineers responsible for creating the machine that took over the world, Jans, Charpentier, Winterblay, and Ziembicki, were given pay freezes shortly after the C64 launched. By the spring of 1983, nearly all of them had left Commodore. They went on to create a new company called Ensoniq, where they would continue their work by designing electronic musical instruments and synthesizers. And while those engineers were walking away, Tramiel had already made a decision that would shape Commodore's future. He had rejected the development of a 16-bit successor processor, unwilling to invest heavily in technology he could not immediately see or hold in his hands. The fuse had been lit. The next chapter was already beginning. On January 13, 1984, Jack Tramiel entered a Commodore board meeting and walked out as the company's leader. He would never return. The exact cause of the split is still debated. Leonard Tramiel, Jack's son, later said his father had become frustrated with Irving Gould's use of company resources for personal matters. Gould, who had maintained control of Commodore since 1966, had built a corporate structure that included large executive salaries, duplicate offices across multiple countries, and extensive international travel paid for by the company, arrangements that also helped reduce his personal tax obligations. For Tramiel, the issue came down to control. If he could not run Commodore according to his own vision, he believed there was no reason to remain. You can interpret that moment in two different ways, and the truth lies somewhere between both perspectives. Tramiel's relentless focus on cutting costs and his unwillingness to invest heavily in future research had already pushed away many of the engineers responsible for creating the C64. His management style, where he personally approved nearly every expense above $1,000, turned Commodore's leadership ranks into a constant cycle of departures and replacements. But there was another side to the story. Tramiel was also the one executive who understood how to compete through aggressive pricing and turn a price war into victory. When he left, Commodore lost the person who had built its strategy around discipline, efficiency, and survival, and no successor was ever able to truly replace him. Months later, Tramiel returned to the industry by purchasing Atari's consumer division from Warner Communications and transforming it into a new rival. 4 senior Commodore executives followed him, leaving the company he had built behind. To replace him, Irving Gould brought in Marshall F. Smith, a professional corporate manager. Under Smith's leadership, Commodore acquired Amiga Corporation, a small Silicon Valley startup, in a deal worth approximately $25 million. The Amiga 1000 arrived in July 1985 with a price tag of $1,295, and by almost any fair standard, it was a computer far ahead of its era. It featured true preemptive multitasking, a full-color graphical user interface, and audio and video capabilities that made the Macintosh and IBM PC appear outdated by comparison. It should have defined the next generation of personal computing, but Commodore never figured out what the Amiga truly represented. who its audience was, or how to explain why it mattered. Instead, the company released a confusing lineup of different models and failed to position the machine in front of the creative professionals who could have turned it into an industry standard. Apple had a vision and a message. IBM had a clear identity. Commodore had a revolutionary computer, but no story to tell. The financial numbers tell the story. By 1993, Commodore's decline had become impossible to ignore. Sales dropped by 20%, and the company recorded a loss of $366 million. While the business was collapsing, Irving Gould continued receiving compensation. The company had already sold off the semiconductor manufacturing facilities that once gave Commodore its greatest advantage, the chip factories that allowed it to design and build its own hardware at lower costs. Those facilities had been the foundation of Commodore's success. Without them, the company lost the ability to create the custom chips that made the Amiga unique. And without the Amiga's technological edge, Commodore was left competing in a market rapidly being taken over by IBM-compatible computers running Microsoft Windows. On April 29, 1994, Commodore International reached the end of the road. The company announced a voluntary liquidation and filed for bankruptcy protection. A corporation that had once brought in $1 billion in annual revenue and controlled a significant share of the global home computer market was sold off completely to the German company Escom for approximately $14 million. But Escom's ownership would not last. Just 2 years later, it too collapsed. The valuable patents eventually made their way to Gateway 2000. The Commodore name itself continued moving through different holding companies and licensing deals, eventually appearing on imported electronics that had little connection to the computers that created the brand's legacy. The name remained, but the company was gone. The sign was removed from the building. The offices went quiet. Jack Tramiel, living quietly in retirement in Monte Sereno, California, rarely spoke publicly about the collapse of Commodore. In his final years in business, he had led Atari, eventually selling the company in 1996. Afterward, he focused much of his time on philanthropy, especially the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, an institution he helped establish. Inside that museum, he placed a tribute to Vernon W. Tott with the words, "My liberator and hero." It honored the American soldier who had helped free him from the labor camp in 1945. Jack Tramiel died on April 8, 2012. He was 83 years old, but the Commodore 64 never truly disappeared. Somehow, it refuses to stay in the past. More than 4 decades after it first arrived in homes across America and Europe, the machine continues to live on in a way few computers ever have. Its legacy is not just measured by the millions of units sold, but by the communities that still keep it alive. Independent developers continue creating new software for the C64, discovering new ways to push hardware that was never designed for the modern era. The demo scene, a global community of digital artists and programmers, treats the machine as a creative instrument, producing stunning visual and technical achievements from a 1 MHz processor that should have been impossible to push this far. The SID chip, the remarkable 5-month creation of a 24-year-old engineer with a passion for electronic music, went on to become one of the defining sounds of chiptune and early electronic music culture. The Lemon 64 database now documents more than 15,000 Commodore 64 titles. Original machines continue to be bought and sold, with working units ranging from around $50 to several $100 depending on condition, rarity, and completeness. And decades after the original machine changed computing history, the Commodore name returned to the spotlight. In 2025, a new company operating under the Commodore brand, with Leonard Tramiel serving as an advisor, introduced the Commodore 64 Ultimate, an FPGA-based recreation of the legendary computer housed in the classic bread bin-style case, featuring HDMI output and compatibility with more than 10,000 original titles. Starting at $300, the machine was praised by reviewers as a remarkable revival. Even the molds used to create the plastic shell were not new reproductions. They were the original steel tools from the Commodore production era, recovered, restored, and brought back into service. There is a certain kind of American story that feels almost impossible to believe. A man survives one of the darkest horrors of the 20th century, crosses an ocean with nothing but his determination, and builds something that changes the course of technology forever. But Jack Tramiel's story carries a different ending than most. He did not lose it to a rival company. He did not lose it because someone created a better machine. He lost it inside a boardroom, to a chairman who placed personal priorities above the future of the company, and to a generation of executives who inherited the greatest manufacturing advantage in personal computing and slowly dismantled it piece by piece. Commodore did not lose the personal computer battle because it was defeated by a stronger enemy. It lost because the company removed the commander who knew how to win, and the people who followed never learned how to fight the same war. But the machine itself survived. It outlasted the company that created it. It outlasted the executives who made the decisions. It outlasted the era that gave it birth. Somewhere today, someone is still sitting in front of a Commodore 64 typing load *81, pressing return, and waiting as a world of possibilities appears one line at a time on a screen. The typewriter repairman from the Bronx would have understood. His entire life was spent taking broken things, rebuilding them, and making them work again. And he created a machine that is still doing exactly that. If you ever owned a Commodore 64, a VIC-20, an Amiga, or worked for Commodore or any of the companies that helped build its machines, leave a comment below. Tell us the model you had, the year you got it, and whether it still powers on today. The people who used these computers and the people who created them remember what the company became and what was lost better than the executives who eventually sold it away. If this story connected with you, subscribe and become part of the archive, because we are documenting the companies that shaped the electronic world, one story at a time. The history of American technology is too important to disappear beneath the noise. Another American tech empire is coming next, and the way that story ends is one you will not want to miss.